It's my pleasure to introduce Reverend Patrick Riecke, who comes to us from Parkview in Indiana, who is going to be our presenter of this workshop. Just as a mode of introduction, I have always been interested in burnout theory, and I am a disciple of the Pines idea. Before you could be burnt out, you first had to be on fire. So this notion of burnout, the idea behind Pines' discussion is people who care are the ones who burn out. People who don't care are the ones who stay.
Absolutely.
So with that, I'll turn it over to Reverend Patrick Riecke. And for those of you who are on virtual option, the word is burnout.
Thank you, Harvey. It sounds like Harvey may be able to give this presentation instead of me presenting today. He's got a good introduction there for our topic today. I'm going to just switch over here to another slideshow. There we are. Well, I want to start with a confession. I will have a few confessions today. My first one that Harvey kind of indicated is that I am not from Ohio, so I apologize in advance for that. I'm wondering, I heard OH. I don't know what that is about or what that's for. I don't know what that has something to do with your state or a school that's here or something like that. I think it's Ohio University. Is that what is? No, that's not it. Okay, I apologize. So I'm just making sure if you're paying attention. Y'all have a lot of universities as we're going through the awards and everything, hearing all the students and presenters and educators from the different universities. That's fantastic. So I work at Parkview Health in Northeast Indiana, so we're almost from Ohio. It only took me about 10 minutes to get into Ohio from Fort Wayne. We actually are in contract agreements right now with a small hospital in Bryan, Ohio, so we're about to become a health system that includes Ohio in a more purposeful way than we have before, so we're very excited about that. My title there is Director for Dignity and Spiritual Care. I'm also our ethics chairperson, so as you can imagine with ethics, and it sounds like that's been a bit of a topic already throughout the conference, talking about equity and ethics and how do we treat one another with ethical regard, dignity, that sort of thing. So you can imagine working in that field. There's been some moral distress over the past few years, and I'm going to share a little bit about that with you today. So let's go ahead and begin. And welcome to our virtual attendees. I guess this is one of the workshops that is being live streamed for our virtual attendees. So those of you that you didn't have much of a choice, I think there was only 2 workshops you could do if you're virtual. So those of you in the room, kudos for picking this topic. I'm sorry to those of you that are on virtual, you kind of got stuck with me or another option, but we'll hopefully have a good time together. So let's just talk a little bit of background about moral distress. What is this phenomenon of moral distress? So it goes back to the 80s. Andrew Jameson defined moral distress as a phenomenon in which we know the right action, but we are constrained from taking it. It sort of sounds like a description of the last few years of our lives, right? We know what we want to do, we know what we feel like we ought to do, but we are constrained at times from being able to do that. As you likely know, the VA has had a lot to say about burnout and moral distress. Certainly this runs parallel with post-traumatic stress disorder as well. So VA psychiatrists in the 1990s coined the phrase moral injury. So the VA says that moral injury can occur in response to acting. So you're doing something or you're witnessing, you're watching something, behaviors that go against a person's values and moral beliefs. So that's sort of the background, the history, the historical definitions of these two. This is my definition of moral distress that occurs when we take or witness an action that violates our values. So I've done something, or I've had to watch something happen that runs contrary to what I think is right, is moral, is valuable, or important. When those things are sudden or profound, and sometimes they're sudden and profound, moral injury can occur a step beyond moral distress. And then let's talk just briefly about a definition of burnout. U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy holds a healthcare worker burnout as one of his top priorities. He wrote a 76-page advisory on healthcare coworker burnout. And certainly, I know some of you are in sort of healthcare adjacent fields. This obviously runs parallel for you as well. So you'll hear me talk a little bit about nurses and doctors and some of the studies that have been done with them. But you'll also hear me say this doesn't just run for nurses and doctors. It runs for just about anyone in a helping profession, particularly with what we've experienced here recently. So Dr. Murthy and others say burnout holds 3 characteristics: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization or cynicism, and then just that sense that you're not being able to make the difference at work that you wish you could make. So perhaps when you saw emotional exhaustion, you felt like, yeah, I felt that. Maybe I feel that. Hopefully you don't feel that as much during a time like this when you're at a conference and you're receiving and you're learning, and if you're an extrovert, you're just loving all the social interaction. If you're an introvert, you can't wait to get into a car by yourself and like close the door and say, oh, okay, yeah. But hopefully that you're not feeling that emotional exhaustion as much these couple of days. But my guess is many of you can look back over the past few years or a career and see times when you experienced that. Depersonalization or cynicism. We know that those of us who are in the helping profession, sarcasm is a gift of many of ours, maybe a dark gift. Some of you are smiling because you must have that dark gift, or you're sitting close to someone with that gift. But sometimes sarcasm goes a little further, right, all the way to cynicism. To make a joke about something, but to not really be able to take things seriously, then goes to that next step where we're not really connecting as people. Perhaps I'm performing at the same level that I've performed at before, but I'm so cynical about what's happening and the possibility of it ever getting better that I've decoupled personally from the situation. And then I think this last one really hits us profoundly. We heard Sue talk just a little bit ago about the idea of meaningful work, that she'd been able to engage in meaningful work for all these years. Well, sometimes we choose a field that we know is meaningful, but then we go through seasons where we question, am I really making the difference that I want to make? And I don't mean just like ideals and, I want to do more, that sort of thing, but the question, really, am I making any difference at all? And when we start to feel that, when we come into work or we show up to do the work that we have to do on a daily basis, and we're questioning that every day, am I really able to make the difference here that I want to make? That may be an indication that you are burned out. I like this cartoon. This woman is sitting in a doctor's office, and above the fire extinguisher it says, break glass in case of physician burnout. So it's available in case the doctors come in and is totally burnt out. She looks a little distressed by that thought, and I think some of us can understand those feelings. So when someone talks about coworker engagement, this is very important, especially in the hospital world. We talk all the time about how engaged our coworkers are. Or they talk about compassionate care, and it feels like a memory to you instead of something you're feeling right now. That's an indication you may be burned out. When you have run out of cares to give, my teenagers say that phrase in a different way. When you run out of cares to give, I didn't feel it was appropriate to share the language they use for this one, but when you've run out of cares to give. So if you're feeling burned out, you might feel trapped, hopeless, overly sarcastic, not just sarcastic, but overly sarcastic, numb. You might feel like you're just going through the motions. So let's highlight a couple surveys before we start talking about what we can do about this. In a survey of critical care nurses, a staggering 92% of nurses said that the pandemic, what they experienced during the pandemic, would shorten their careers. 92%. Now, these are nurses in ICU, seeing certainly the tip of the spear of what we were experiencing during the height of the pandemic. But that's a huge margin of nurses saying that this would shorten their careers. Depending on what information you look at, between 18 to 25% of healthcare workers have quit their jobs since the beginning of the pandemic, with a lot of them leaving the industry. We've already talked today, and it sounds like it's been a topic for the past couple of days about enough workers in the field, enough people who are willing to continue the mission that you all have carried for so long. And how do we keep people engaged, not burned out, so that they don't leave the profession looking for something that's going to carry less of a moral and emotional load. An article from The Atlantic, I guess the title tells us all we need to know about this article: why healthcare workers are quitting in droves. Between 35 and 54% of American nurses and physicians were burned out before the pandemic began. See, burnout didn't start 3 years ago, right? That wasn't a new phenomenon. There were a lot of coworkers in helping professions that were burned out long before we got to a pandemic experience. So the research really points to two common things, and I referenced this earlier. Nurses are the most affected by moral distress right now in the helping professions, but all disciplines are affected. So in every survey, if they surveyed physicians, NPs, PAs, nurses, nursing techs, housekeepers, social workers, chaplains, everybody that they surveyed came back saying that they were experiencing some level of moral distress, some level of emotional exhaustion or burnout. One last study, and then we'll move on. This study was an international study, found that 44% of Australian nurses were experiencing high emotional exhaustion, 66% of US nurses, high levels of burnout, and 63% of Canadian nurses were experiencing high emotional exhaustion. So if you wanted to go to a workshop that's just going to depress you today, welcome. This is the news and probably not a lot of new information for you. So let me tell you a little bit about my story, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more of my story later. But you remember at the beginning of the pandemic and some of the conversations and concerns and fear and unknown. You remember that a lot of our healthcare facilities, of course, for some time had to adopt a zero visitor policy. Well, as the director for dignity and the ethics chairperson, our executives turned to me to see what I thought. We did not adopt it as quickly as other healthcare systems had, but I did feel at that point that it was the right thing to do with the information we had at the time to say we're not allowing any visitors. Now, one of the teams that I lead is the chaplaincy team, and our chaplaincy team responds to every death in the hospital. And so we had been in the habit for years, for literally decades, of calling people to say, hey, your mom is near the end. Please come to the hospital and be with her at the end. And now we were saying, the one who leads that department was saying, we should not do that anymore. We should tell people, in fact, quite the opposite. You cannot come to the hospital. You cannot come to our high-performing partners. You cannot come. So we had totally flipped the script, right, from what we had believed for so long and made this recommendation. So after the executives asked me, I polled our ethics committee because I didn't want it just to come from me. And our ethics committee is made up of multidisciplinary, lots of different professionals, both within our healthcare system and some community members. It came back at a 100% unanimous that they felt as though it was time to say we had a zero visitor policy. And we saw that, of course, all across the United States. So I brought that back to our executives. I said, I think it's time. Our ethics committee thinks that it's time. And the executives delayed. Understandably, right? Nobody wants to be the one that says we're going to go to a zero visitor policy. But they delayed, and I had that sense of, why have you asked me if what we have told you is not going to be, acted upon? I knew a lot of the nursing leaders felt similarly. They were the ones seeing what was happening on the hospital units. But that delay, and at that point during the pandemic, a day felt like about 10 years. There was so much new information coming in, so many things changing. You were hearing about, eventually starting to hear about friends and family and loved ones who are contracting the virus, and everything felt so compressed. So the delay probably, in my mind, it lasted for months. It probably lasted for a week or something like that. But the delay felt as though some other rules had changed our healthcare system. The rules that, in my opinion, would be held in high regard. The rules that the ethics committee's recommendations would be acted upon. It felt as though the rules had changed there too. So this is really a relatively minor example, I would say, and maybe I'm downplaying my own experience just a little bit, but a relatively minor example of moral distress, but it did impact me in these three ways. I used to think that our recommendations would be acted upon. Second of all, I just felt badly about making the recommendation. I believed it was the right thing to do at that point. Now I've had other thoughts since that time, but at the time I believed it was the right thing, but that doesn't mean I felt good about it. I felt badly about the recommendation that we were making. And then about a year later in the state of Indiana, I don't know about Ohio, but Indiana passed a law saying that we would never be allowed to have a zero visitor policy at our healthcare systems again. So now I'm like illegal retroactively. Feeling badly about it, and now realizing that the decision we made, if we tried to do it again today, that we would actually be violating the law, increased a sense of moral distress, because generally I prefer to obey the law, especially when it comes to what I'm doing at work, and the sense that we had done something that would later be outlawed caused a bit of moral distress. So just a reminder, we want to be clear about definitions here. It occurs when you take an action or you witness an action that goes contrary to your values, and when sudden and profound moral injury can occur. What this really results in, I'll put a little bit of my pastor hat on for a second now and one more time at the end, it really splits ourselves. So we have these internal values, morals, belief systems, perhaps built on religious tradition, but perhaps just our own personally held values. And then when we take action that is in contrary to those values, or we're having to watch other people take action contrary to those values, it makes our body sort of do things that our spirit is unwilling to do. And so we have a sense of disengagement, of separateness. This is the actual definition of disintegration, right? Where we're disintegrated as a person. I'm doing things that I don't feel good about spiritually, and I'm not able to sort of settle back into those values, those morals that I hold internally. Another clinical example, this is pre-pandemic. We had a patient, an elderly patient on one of our floors who, and we know, and we've talked a little bit about ageism already today, but we know that just because a patient's elderly doesn't mean that their care should change. But that in combination with other comorbidities and sicknesses that are happening right then does inform the situation at least somewhat. So this patient was elderly. She was very frail, very weak physically. Her brain had started to die because of some sickness that she was experiencing. She was not brain dead, but she had necrosis of the brain. She had metastasized cancer all through her body. And she'd been in our hospital for a long time, not able to communicate, not able to talk, not able to do a blinking of the eyes or squeezing of the hand for quite some time. Her organs were all failing, and of course, as you might imagine, she was vent dependent. However, you see the all caps letters there at the bottom. Her family kept her as a full code. Well, imagine that you're a nurse caring for this patient. And you know that if her heart stops, according to the order that's on the chart right now, you're going to go into this patient's room and start to do chest compressions on her. You're going to push a whole lot of medication. You're going to have this whole huge team in the room working on a patient in this kind of condition. Well, I'm sorry to say that is exactly what happened. And this patient, because the family asked for her to be maintained as a full code, which was their right to request, this patient received CPR for 47 minutes. And our nurses, I mean, you imagine the family, but also the nurses, tears streaming down their face, being forced to do this to this patient, knowing that even if they were able to get pulses back, that wasn't going to heal her cancer. It wasn't going to heal necrosis of the brain. It wasn't going to heal the organs that had started to shut down. So there wasn't really a good reason to do what they were doing, and yet they were taking violent acts, really, against this patient. The granddaughter was, I think, the only one. It happened in the middle of the night, as it often does. I think the granddaughter was the only one that was in the room at the time, and of course, she stood in the corner just watching. And I can't imagine her life since that time, right? How that has stuck with her. Because grief is one thing, trauma is another thing. So she was going to experience grief when her grandmother died, but she had to experience trauma in addition to the grief. So just another reminder, this is moral distress. When we take an action, so imagine these nurses taking an action, or imagine the other providers in the room watching this action being taken that violated their personal values. This is a little bit of a continuum here. Harvey talked about this a little bit at the beginning as we're talking up here. You have to begin with a moral awareness. Harvey said, you've got to be on fire before you can burn out. In other words, you have to care. There's not a whole lot of uncaring people experiencing moral distress because they don't care. So this is a liability for those of you in the room who care about your patients, who care about your clients, who care about your coworkers and your communities, care about your residents. So the more you care, the more likely you're going to encounter moral distress. And then the truth of it is, that we showed earlier, just about everybody in the healthcare profession experiences some moral distress. The good news is, if that moral distress is mitigated, you're probably not going to experience moral injury, burnout, anxiety, some of the other impacts of this. But it certainly sets you on the trajectory towards that. So again, Dr. Murthy talks about burnout being characterized by a high degree of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, cynicism, and a low sense of personal accomplishment at work. I want to tell you just a little bit more of my story. So that was, I told you my story of how things began for me during a pandemic as the ethics chairperson and a department director for our healthcare system. Let me tell you a little bit about how it ended. In the fall of 2022, so not very long ago, just about 6 months ago, we had come through just a really, as everybody, through a hard time through the pandemic. Emotional exhaustion would be a good way to describe what I was feeling at that point in time. I told you that our chaplaincy team responds to every death during the pandemic, so we marked that. Everybody's got sort of their own parameters for when the pandemic started, and certainly a lot of variety on when it ended, if it has ended. But the way that we marked it was about 2.5 years of time. During those 2.5 years, our chaplains in our healthcare system responded to 5,563 patient deaths. Obviously not all COVID by any stretch, but COVID did inflate the numbers during that time. So they stood by while there was FaceTime goodbyes, Skype family meetings instead of people in the room with their loved one. Furthermore, for me personally, I went through some leadership conflict at that point in time, really not related to what I shared earlier about our executives, but some other leadership conflict that was probably, honestly, mostly my fault as I look back on it. Certainly at the time, I did not think it was my fault. We never do, usually during the time, but as I look back on it, probably I was the one to blame for leadership conflict that arose during that time. Taking meetings on weekends, that disruption of personal life and family life. And I don't know if any of you did this as well, but I had to cut back my interaction with social media during the pandemic. When I started seeing friends, family members say things that flew in the face of what we were seeing, in our hallways at the hospital, and saying them angrily and with a lot of emotion, I had to set it aside. And then the one that I maintained, I cut down my list of friends very significantly. So I provided my own echo chamber, I guess, is really what I did. I only kept friends that I knew were going to sort of violate my values, but I had to do that for a time for my mental health. Really, this would be how I would sum it up. The work that I enjoyed for so long was killing me. Really couldn't take it anymore. And then I had a shocking experience, and I apologize, that's a pun, and if you read down through the list there, you might figure out why that's a pun before I get to the part of the story. But on my 44th birthday, just in this past fall, so that's how old I am now, on my 44th birthday, I woke up. It was actually Labor Day, and so didn't have to go to work that day, which is great, but I woke up and my heart was out of rhythm. And I wear an Apple Watch. I'm sure many of you have a smartwatch of some kind, and it popped up after a few hours telling me that I may be experiencing, and I can never pronounce it correctly, atrial fibrillation. That's where I get stuck. Somebody say it for me. AFib. That's why it says AFib. I can't spell it either. So, but my watch knew how to spell it and how to say it, so it told me, oh, you may be experiencing this. So I went to the hospital, and I think they kind of hate it when you go to the hospital and you say, my watch is telling me something. They seemed to hate it when I told them that, but they said, well, let's go ahead and check you out anyway. Put me on EKG, and they said, sure enough, Apple Watch was correct. You're experiencing AFib for the first time. And so here I am in the hospital, just a few floors down from where my office suite is, and I'm being treated as a patient on my birthday. Not what I'd planned to do. I wanted to go to Mexican, and get some Mexican food for lunch. I did not want to be in the hospital. And so the doctor comes in, and he sits down beside me, and I really felt fine. I mean, I could tell that something wasn't right, but I wasn't having any pain. I wasn't having a heart attack or anything like that. So I'm thinking, okay, probably some medicine or something. And he says, well, what we do for people in your situation is we administer a shock to your chest. And I thought he was kidding me. And I said that. I said, you're kidding, right? He didn't smile at all. No, I'm not kidding you. He said, this is what we do. I said, but I feel pretty much fine. I've seen shock lots of times in the hospital, but those people are always out of it. They come in a heart attack. We know before they get here, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, well, because of your situation, this is your first onset with AFib. It's within the first 24 hours. You know when it started. This is the right next step for us. He said, so we're going to sedate you, and we're going to do cardioversion. Had never heard that word before that day. Basically, they were going to shock me. And I said, do I have to be sedated for that? And he said, that's not a question I've had before. Nobody's ever asked if they could do it unsedated. I said, well, is there a medical contraindication? If I can avoid taking any more medicine than absolutely necessary, I'd like to do that. So they conferred and came back and said, basically, we think you're insane, but no, you don't have to take the sedation if you don't want to. I said, well, if I'm going to be electrocuted, I'd like to remember it and see what it feels like. And they also thought that was crazy. Some of you think that's crazy too. And so they hooked me up, and I'm thinking most things in the hospital take forever. So I'm thinking, a few hours from now, we'll get the right team in here, we'll get the things hooked up, et cetera, et cetera. No, they gathered immediately. Apparently the word got out. A coworker is going to be shocked without sedation. Let's get this done. Everybody come and watch. So there's like 15 people in the room, which was more than necessary, probably in this situation. They hooked me up and shaved my chest, put the patches on, et cetera, et cetera. And he informs me, the doctor says, the computer is actually going to monitor your heart and select the proper time for you to be shocked. I thought, well, we'll probably take just a little while for the computer. Did not take long for the computer to decide when to shock me, because by the time I had that thought, boom, was hit with that shock. And many people have said, would you do it without sedation again? I said, not for fun. Would not do it without sedation again. But thankfully, my heart went back in rhythm. Of course, followed up with a heart monitor. But during the time of that heart monitor, I started to realize the things that had been building up for me, stress-wise, emotionally, the anxiety that I started to feel. I'd never really experienced anxiety until that time. But started to experience it, especially as I wore my heart monitor. I think this is not an uncommon feeling, wearing the heart monitor during that time fed that anxiety. And then I went to my counselor and started to talk with her and talked with my general practitioner. And he said, I'm going to diagnose you with moderate depression. Well, that was a first for me. And I realized that I'm fortunate at 44 to have been experiencing anxiety and depression for the first time in my life. But when you experience something for the first time, it's a signal that you should be paying attention, right? Either to your physical health, your mental health, your emotional health. And so I sat again with a counselor and told her, I said, I had this AFib experience, and then my GP diagnosed me with depression. And I said to her out loud, I don't think the two are related at all, but they're really both, they're very heavy. And when I said they're not related to each other, she went like this. Really? And it was sort of like in a moment, in a flash, I realized that these are not unrelated. These are cumulative sort of effects that have to do with this moral distress and burnout that so many of us have been facing. And remember my identity. We hold fast our identity during these times, don't we? I'm an ordained pastor. I'm a capable leader. I'm the chairperson of the ethics committee. I wear suits to work. I'm serious and like capable and confident, helpful and strong, not a person who's needy and debilitated. So it impacted that sense of my role. So this is not a news flash. This is not new news to you, but the question is, if we have a lot of our friends, a lot of our coworkers experiencing this, then what do we do? So with the remaining time that we have left, I want to talk about a couple of routes that we can take to deal with moral distress and burnout. And I want to think of it as a roadmap. And so the one route is going to be the actions of the car. We'll talk about what that means in a second. And then the second is the heart of the driver. Do you remember these? There's not too many real young people in the room, so I think most of us will remember when this. Hey, don't tell us if you don't remember, because it'll make the rest of us feel quite a bit older. MapQuest was the original GPS. You had to print these off. Hope to God you were right. Hope to God that you checked the button avoid ferries. We made that mistake one time, did not check the button avoid ferries, and all of a sudden we're in rural Kentucky with our dog puking in the back because we've been going like this, back and forth, and we come around a bend and it's there's a ferry waiting to take us across the river. It was not the directions that we would have chosen. Now Google Maps would reroute us, but when you just have the print off from the computer lab, that's all you've got to work with. So yeah, kids today will never know this was the original GPS. You had to read it fast and correctly from the passenger side seat to make sure that the driver didn't get upset with you about where you were going. So that's a little bit of how I want to think about these next several steps that we can take within our organizations. So the first turn we want to take is an opt-out. An opt-out. I don't need to tell you, we don't all have the same set of values. We don't all have the same set of morals. Something might put strain on you and your values that wouldn't put strain on me and my values. So giving you the option at those times when you've got something that's really straining you to opt out. We have 5 of us that take on call for ethics. One of us is young. It's not me, newsflash. But one of us is young, and she's still childbearing age. And she was pregnant for a time while she was serving as ethics on call. And she said, if an ethics situation comes up with a mom and a baby, I can't take that one. And we said, of course. We gave her the opportunity to opt out of that situation. Now, we have to provide services, right? We have to find a way to provide the services, but if there's a situation or a client that's really pulling on one coworker's morals, then maybe we can give them the option to opt out. Other times, we just need a timeout. We have to do this. We know it's going to be hard on everybody. Maybe we've got a client that we really love, and they're nearing the end of their life, or they're going through a difficult time. I know there's at least one person here who works with APS, and so you're having to look these things right in the eye. But maybe we can take a timeout and recognize this is really hard. And as a leader, as a coworker, to say, let's take a step back and acknowledge that this is really distressing. Next, and this is really the key, leaders who listen. Next turn on the driving directions out of moral distress and burnout is leaders who listen, who actually hear what you have to say. This is really, when you look through the research of how to mitigate burnout in an organization, the number one link is leaders and organizations who care, who pay attention to what their coworkers are telling them. And it's great to get an email about a resource that your organization has, but it's much better if your leader listens to your concerns, hears what you're going through, right? Well-being programs. So there was a great study at Community Health in central Indiana showing that the more well-being initiatives were available for physicians, the better the patient satisfaction scores came out. In other words, if the doctors and providers of care were well taken care of, they took great care of patients. And so there's a lot of studies going on around well-being programs, and there's new jobs cropping up all the time for well-being. I'm sure some of you, at least some of your work has to do with the well-being of your clients. But here's a warning. If an organization says, you've got to work longer than you probably are able to, we don't have enough staff, we can't cover everybody, but we're going to make you do all this extra work, your wages are being docked, support systems are being removed, and then you hand the coworkers a gratitude journal, this might be what you're experiencing at that point. A well-being program that is, it's not really on fire, hopefully. But a well-being program that's not coupled with leaders who listen and a supportive organization is not going to be successful. So this is what we say about well-being programs. They're most noticeable when they're absent. They're most noticeable when they're absent. So if you're going through a really difficult time at work and there's nothing about Hey, here's a way to take a break. Hey, here's a way to invest in yourself. Here's an opportunity or a resource to make sure that you're okay. We're going to notice that. Next, non-punitive ways to say that we're struggling. How do you, in a professional role, say, I'm not sure I can do this right now. I'm not sure I'm okay. I'm not sure I can, because the work that you do requires emotion, requires engagement, requires compassion. Most of you aren't coming in on a daily basis and flipping hamburgers. You're not coming in and crunching numbers. You're doing things that require an emotional connection. And so how can you say, without getting in trouble, hey, I'm not doing very well right now? How can I get resources and help for that? Next, similarly, non-punitive error reporting. How do I say this is not going right as an organization? We didn't do right by this client, by this patient, by this resident. How can I bring that up without fearing retribution, without fearing that somebody's going to get mad at me because I said something? Because none of us entered the field thinking we want to provide really low quality care. We got into the field thinking, how can we help people? And when we make errors and we do things that harm people, we know that we're not really providing that high quality care that we want to provide. Next, peer-to-peer support. I hope there's just a ton of peer-to-peer support happening for you at the conference right now. People you came with, people that you've met here, people that can encourage you, say, I've seen similar things. There's some great models out there for peer support. I love this phrase, conversation among colleagues who have shared traumatic experience. Maybe this sounds like lunch at your office, right? Like when we have lunch together, or when we're all on a Teams call together, or all on a Skype call together, we might be just sharing our traumatic experiences that we're having. But being able to share that and feel like you're seen, and feel like other people have gone through similar things and they're able to understand. This emphasizes bearing witness, like I see you. When we're seen doing these difficult things, some of the difficulty is diminished. Normalizing their reactions. Say, you know what, I remember when I had a case that was like that, and I felt similarly. And then all of a sudden the person doesn't feel like they're going crazy, right? Like, okay, somebody else has gone through this, they've had a similar feeling, so this peer-to-peer support, whether formal or informal. I'm not going to talk about each of these, but these are a few other potential turns. So hopefully there's a lot of these that you're looking at, you're saying, my organization is doing really well with these. Maybe there's one to take away and do even just a little better. So a culture that recognizes the global problems. A culture that says, you know what, we realize this is a problem in the world right now, instead of trying to ignore the problem that's happening. A culture that recognizes the local problems. We recognize it's a problem in our corner of the world, in our organization, in our community. Next, providing the necessary tools to do the job. This is huge. If you feel like I'm here to make a difference, but my phone never works, I'm here to really make a positive difference in this person's lives, these people's lives, but the documentation is just a nightmare. I'm here to really change this person's life, but the reimbursement codes that I'm having to put in and the way I'm working with this, and I feel like I'm always working against that, that will increase that sense of moral distress and burnout. Reasonable workloads. Leaders always think that you've got a reasonable workload, right? And I confess I'm one of those. You know, I lead a team that works 24 hours a day. There's somebody's working right now. There's be somebody working overnight tonight. I think that's really reasonable. You know why? Because I'm going to be asleep. Yeah, so I think it's reasonable, but the question is, do they think it's reasonable, right? So it's not just the leader's perspective of what's reasonable, but it's the coworkers, the frontline people, what's their view of reasonable. And then confidential counseling being easily accessible. I think one of the blessings of the pandemic was we got more comfortable doing more serious things in a digital way. And so maybe I can't, especially if I'm a busy professional, maybe I can't get over to the counseling office and sit down for an hour and spill my guts. But maybe I can log on to an app or to a provider, an interaction with a counselor that's in a digital way, and making sure that counseling is easily accessible. It's really important. So system, think about system. We talked about this a little bit. Some systems increase moral distress, EMR or EHR, the bureaucracy that we face. Sometimes there are systems that alleviate moral distress, as we talked about the peer-to-peer confidential support systems, regularly talking about mental health at work. So when I tell people that one of the teams I lead responds to every death in our health system, one of the most frequent questions, and maybe one of your questions would be like, how do you keep doing that? How do you make sure you're okay? Well, I can tell you that for 10 years, every staff meeting that we've had, we talk about, how are you doing? How's your mental health? What's keeping you going? What's revitalizing you? Not because everybody needs to tell us about it at a staff meeting, but because that normalizes the conversation. We recognize that you're dealing with difficult things, and that you might not be doing okay all the time because of that. So talking about it at section meetings, huddles, staff meetings. And this is really the big key. If I could leave you with one thing, and I'm sorry that I can't talk to every one of your leaders at the moment and help them to listen. But when we have a leader, and some of you are leaders now, some of you will be leaders in the future. When you become a leader, do not forget the feelings you had before you were. If you are a leader and you're having a one-on-one with a direct report and you're talking for 80% of the hour you have together, you're doing it wrong. You just are. If you have a staff meeting and you as a leader are talking 80% of the time, you're doing it wrong because you're communicating without saying it overtly. What I have to say is important. What you have to say is not that important. So when they're really struggling, when a coworker is really struggling, what's the chance that they're going to come to you when they have received the message that what I have to say is important, but what you have to say is not as important? So it's not enough that the system is supportive. The data shows it matters when coworkers perceive that it's supportive. So it's not just enough to say, well, we've got EAP and we've got counseling, we've got this app, people have to feel like it's there for them too. So you have to talk about it, you have to nurture that sense of that these resources really are here for you. Moral distress, moral injury, and burnout are unfair. They are unjust. They happen, as Harvey said, they happen to people who care. You have to care first before you get to the point where these things really bother you. So they happen to good people who want to do good work, being thrust into difficult situations again and again. But it also happens all the time. So let's have maybe just a little bit of a time where we think about what if we don't get this right, because it has an impact on our workforce, and we're going to see that here. So quantitatively, the Surgeon General thinks that we'll experience a shortage of between 54 and 139,000 physicians in 10 years. So just that one discipline of physicians is going to recede considerably if we don't address moral distress and burnout. Those 92% of nurses who said that the pandemic stresses would shorten their careers, guess what? Their careers are going to get shorter. They're going to be leaving the profession. A lack of access to health care and essential community resources for our citizens, and really the deterioration of these resources across the United States if we get this wrong. Qualitatively, coworker disengagement. My mom was in the hospital last week. She had a few different issues, ended up having a pacemaker. I can tell you that there were certain nurses that walked in the room, certain care techs, certain case managers that walked in the room who were committed, they were engaged, they were caring, and fortunately that was most of them that walked through the door. I can tell you there were other people that walked through the door who were punching the clock. And I'm not even saying that there's anything wrong with that. It's not a moral judgment because those people have gone through some really difficult things. But the less we address moral distress and burnout, the more frequent our family members are going to have that experience. Higher costs, PTSD, depression, absenteeism, and then, of course, most serious of all, and something we've experienced within some of the areas I work closely with, is suicide. Okay, we're going to turn the corner a little bit to the heart of the driver. Let's talk about you. We've talked about organizations, what your leader ought to be doing, so you can go back and tell all your leaders what they ought to be doing. Now let's talk a little bit about you and what's going on inside of you. You know, if you've been in this situation, sort of either by choice or by force, you've violated your own values, or you've watched as your values were violated, and very few of you probably haven't, a little bit over the past few years at least. If you've been forced to, or you've chosen to work sort of beyond the normal scope of hours or what you should be doing, you may have been experiencing some of this emotional exhaustion and burnout. But we cannot rationalize away our feelings. I cannot go to those nurses who coded that frail patient who listened to the granddaughter bawling in the corner and say, let's talk logically about why you should not feel badly about this. I can't say to them, you did the best you could with the information you had at the time. You had no choice but to do what you did. So in other words, you should not feel any guilt or shame about what you did. It's not going to be helpful for them. No one's going to look at me and say, well, you did what you had to do, so you shouldn't feel badly about restricting visitors. I will always feel badly about restricting visitors during that time. I prayed to God my family members didn't get hospitalized while we had a policy in place that I recommended of 0 visitors. But many people's family members were hospitalized during that time. Logic is not a match for when we're experiencing moral distress. So are you ready to go on the soft side a little bit? What we need is to forgive ourselves. We need self-forgiveness. We need to look back at things that we wish we hadn't had to do, and we need to offer ourselves a little bit of grace. Because forgiving myself says my values were fine. It's good that I felt like a word I probably shouldn't say in front of people, for restricting visitors. I felt horrible. I felt like I was doing something that was wrong. So forgiving myself says, yeah, it was okay that you felt badly about that. Your values were actually sort of in the right place at that point in time. So the fact that you didn't want to lock and bar the door to keep people out when their family members were dying, forgiving myself affirms those values. If I were to excuse myself, that would violate my values. If I were to say, it's really not wrong what I did, it really wasn't mean, it really wasn't, there wasn't anything wrong with having a 0 visitor policy, I'm violating my own values, and that's sort of the core of the problem. Forgiving myself allows me to keep my values intact for the future. So even though I had to do CPR on that patient, I can still believe it was wrong when we have another patient in a similar situation. And then second of all, forgiveness affirms my value. I am not my transgression. I am not the person who had to watch those things. I'm not the person who had to do those things. I'm not identified with it. I'm not the chaplain who prohibits visitors. That's not my identity. And if I can forgive myself for that, I can move on to a different place. I'm not the social worker that doesn't have time for people, the nurse who prolongs the dying process for patients. I'm not identified with that. Instead, I'm a person who cares. And that's why this was hard on me. This is why it was an emotional strain and emotionally exhausting for me during that time. So just a couple more things to say, and then where are we at on time? Do we have time for some conversation? Doing good? Okay. So I will ask you to take your phones out. I'm going to have a QR code on the screen on the next slide. So if your phone hasn't died from battery yet today, I'll have you snap a picture of that and go to it and do a little bit of a survey. And then I'm going to send you out a PDF that's going to have all of this stuff that we've talked about on it today. That'll be easier to take back with you. But before we get to that point, some things that moral distress can't do. It cannot dim your dignity. Cannot take away anything about your worth. You had to do things that you wish you hadn't had to do. It cannot demote your value. Can't wash away your worth. And guys, I had to take my own medicine. I'm recommending you forgive yourself. I had to take my own medicine on this, and several months ago, I had to sit down. For me, it was a pen and paper. And I had to write down, I wish I had not, fill in the blank. I wish I had not watched, fill in the blank. And I wrote item after item after item after item. And that was my way to sort of come to terms with things that I had to do or watch that violated my values, that led me to a point where my counselor and my doctor had to say some things are going to have to change for you to be able to continue forward. So we have to come to that point where we can forgive ourselves. No amount of rationalizing is going to heal our hearts and our souls. So if this was helpful today, if you don't mind taking out your phone and taking a picture of this, I'm going to give you a couple minutes. It's only like 5 questions, and doing that, I'll get out of the way too. Let me know if it actually works, because, technology. Is it working? Okay, somebody gave a little nod. That's good. And then that's going to provide an infographic for you that you'll get in the mail in the next few days, an email in the next few days, kind of outlining everything that we went through today, because I know it is a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. We've used that phrase for a long time, drinking from a fire hose. While you're doing that, I have to tell you a little story of something that happened in our house last night. So my 14-year-old daughter plays rugby, and her coaches told her that she needed to really hydrate. And so she, in the course of 2 hours, drank 128 ounces of water. And she became overhydrated, which I didn't know was an actual thing until last night. And she started to feel woozy and like she was going to pass out, very lightheaded. We had to pick her up from a friend's house. I thought she'd been slipped something. In fact, I was very angry. I came in as the judgmental dad, like, what did somebody do to my daughter that she's feeling this way? And then as it wore off, it was like, sweetheart, you drank like almost 1.5 gallons of water in about an hour and a half. No wonder you're feeling really poorly. So whenever someone uses the phrase, it's like drinking from a fire hose in the future, I will remember Kelsey, sort of literally drinking from a fire hose. It really doesn't, you don't feel very good after a while. Okay, one last thing. A lot of you are looking up, so I think you've gotten through with that. If you can't, I'm going to put my pastor hat back on for just a second here. Because some of you came in today carrying some guilt still. Maybe it's from something you had to be a part of a long time ago. Maybe it was last week. Maybe it was last year. But you're carrying around that sense of, I did something that I don't feel good about. And when I said self-forgiveness, it rang hollow for you. You don't feel like you can forgive yourself. So if you're not there yet, let me go back into my pastor framework here and just tell you, you are forgiven. What you were given as you served our public, served your clients, served patients during this time, especially those that are our older citizens, the task you were given was an impossible task. And if you didn't live up to your own personal standards for yourself during that time, you can be forgiven, and you are forgiven. And we need you, and your value continues and endures. Your values were in the right place. That's why you felt badly about some of these things that you've had to experience in the past. And as we move forward, we need you. We need your participation. We need what you bring to the table. So just to conclude, the roadmap includes these two equally important paths: driving directions, the actual practical things that we need to do, systems that alleviate moral distress instead of increasing it, leaders who listen, and then we need to turn it inward and say, I can forgive myself for this so that I can maybe start to move away from the depersonalization, the cynicism, the emotional exhaustion, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we've got a little bit of time. I don't have like any audience participation questions, but I'd be happy. Comments, questions, you probably have thoughts about some of these things that you've experienced before. Or we can just stand here and look at each other blankly for a little while.
Thanks for reminding me, Harvey.
Thank you, Patrick, for a great presentation. As I listened to you, my thought was how to help leaders, of which I am one, recognize that because the pandemic is over, people can't just go back to what was. And so, and not just the things that we know, people lost loved ones and that, but it had an emotional toll, period. And so how do we help everyone, including ourselves, realize that but not live there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer for that, but I think one way that we've done it, sort of unintentionally, but it ended up really shedding some interesting light, was looking at coworkers or people that you're working with, volunteers, who have come on since the pandemic ended, and I like your air quotes for that, who knows, and assess their experience and contrast with those who had been there for a long time before the pandemic and then worked through it. Or, in one of our departments, we had 3 coworkers who started within about 3 months before March 2020. And so they've worked there for a few years, but really have only known time during the pandemic. And I think when you look at the contrast, I'll be transparent. The newest coworker, well, we have 3 coworkers who've started really since things basically died down for our experience in our corner of the world. One of them has been quite irritating to the rest of us because she rightly complains about things that the rest of us have been taking for granted because of how things have gone the past few years. But we've found ourselves wanting to say, look, you don't realize how hard this really was. And there's actually something beautiful in that, I think, when you look at the different experiences. what's really unfortunate is a lot of our, you're asking me to wander into some dangerous territory here, but a lot of our executive leaders weren't at our facilities much. My leader, and I don't blame him. If I'd had this option, I would have taken it too, but he didn't darken the door of one of our hospitals for 18 months. And then knowing what my team's doing, now I was kind of hybrid. I was halfway between him and my teams. But knowing that my chaplains responded to over 5,000 deaths while my leader never came to the hospital, I'm not sure I could teach him how to understand. I can't. I've tried a little bit. I've been unsuccessful. So I'm not sure what the right pathway is for in that case. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or?
I can talk to you offline,
Okay.
but I had the same experience.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
How would you respond to the higher-ups, like the executives of your agency, that really don't do the groundwork and really understand what the departments go through? How do you, in a sense, get the buy-in, I guess, that there is a need for education, mental health? How would you respond to that?
Yeah. So can I ask you to refine your question just a little bit? So you're asking how to get the higher ups to see sort of the need for support for the teams? Yeah, that's a great question. There's lots of studies in the PowerPoint that you'll get eventually. I think it's on your last slide, has a bunch of those studies. So some leaders are data people, and they like that. They like to see the numbers of what people are experiencing. So some of those for a data-driven leader could be helpful. Others are story-based, and they want to hear the stories of what your coworkers, I think, are going through. And then one thing that I've adjusted to a little bit with my leader, who, like I said, didn't have the same experience of the pandemic that I did, is every time we talk, I talk about it, and not in a I need you to do something sort of way. Most of the time, it's we just had our engagement survey results, and our department, one of our departments was the chaplaincy department, was in the top 10% of most engaged departments. And so instead of saying, isn't that great that we were in the top 10% engaged, I said, considering the fact that they've responded to 5,563 deaths and they've all been really stressed out and we don't have enough staff, that's pretty great, isn't it? And so just that reminder that it's a topic of conversation constantly. I've made the mistake many times of waiting for them to figure it out without me saying much about it. That's not going to happen. Even me saying a lot about it is no guarantee that it's going to register. But at some point, they're going to have to recognize, like, this is something that is always a topic of conversation. So I'm not sure that's going to solve your dilemma, but those are some of my thoughts.
Any other questions? Oh. I'm getting my steps in too.
So I've contributed to your exercise. Those of us in education have a parallel. This past year, maybe even this spring semester, we're seeing students who are still disengaged, even though they're in class. They're not participating the way they have in the past. They're victims of their experiences this last year or so. And I think for faculty, we're sort of in that moral dilemma of, we want them to do what they have to do, but at the same time, we also want to be understanding. And so I think that's a challenge for the education world that parallels the service world.
Yeah, having sons that have graduated the last 3 years from high school, one that's entered a state university, the disruption that they've experienced on the student end is so significant, and some of them don't know any different because that's how they entered, and so their level of disengagement they think is normal. Yeah.
Any other questions? No? All right. Yeah, yeah.
It's not really a question, it's just a comment. You were sharing the story about the
granddaughter and the grandmother or whoever it was that was needing resuscitation, and that they put, I think it's what is the code for when you're not supposed to resuscitate? There's a nurse in DNR. So the DNR, thank you. I'm not a nurse, obviously. So my dad died at 94, my father-in-law died at 90, and we had the same experience with both of them as they started to have life challenges and were going to the hospital more frequently. We'd had family conversations. They both had agreed DNR was appropriate. Yes, DNR if we go. And whenever we would go into the hospital, like they'd be emergency, rushed into the hospital for something, and they would still be, of sound mind. And the hospital staff would say, we see you marked DNR, so is that what you want, DNR? And they'd be like, no, do everything you can to keep me alive. And we would be like, really? So I do think that you don't know what it's like to live through that stage in life. And as, people who understood the logic of DNR, when it was time for them to say, yeah, I might die today, they were like, no, do everything you can do to keep me alive. So you don't know kind of what messaging that woman might have given to her family.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good point.
For sure. Yeah, it's a little different. It's different in theory than it is when you're being wheeled back, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, and on the opposite side, when I walked in 2 weeks ago to my mom's hospital room and saw the DNR bracelet on, I was like, okay, she's serious. Like, she's always, like, similar to your folks, always said that, but now she's actually here, and she was following through with it. And so even though I know that's probably what's best and it's what she wants and it's her wishes, I had a little bit of a repulsion to it, like, why is my mom wearing a DNR bracelet? But it was the right thing.
Well, thank you so much,
Yeah,
Patrick.
thank you guys, appreciate it.
Yeah, I think we're real close in time here. If you're a virtual attendee, the code word is oh, it's on the sheet up there. Let me look real quick. Sorry about that. Please remember to fill out your evaluation and sign out for CEs. And the code word is, just a minute here. Roadmap. So, ties in with our speaker. So, thank you so much for your time today, Patrick, and your sharing your story, and it's certainly a timely topic right now. So, thank you.